Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I have Alexander Tochilovsky on the show. Alexander is the curator at the Herb Lubalin Study Center and is a professor at Cooper Union here in New York. The Lubalin Center, for those of you that don't know, is this amazing archive housed at Cooper Union of the great designer Herb Lubalin's work, but it also houses over 10,000 pieces of design from all across history, from all sorts of designers around the world. It's this really great archive and sort of hidden gem here in New York that if you're ever in town, you really must visit it if you haven't yet. And in this episode, Alexander and I talk about the Lubalin Center, and we talk about him studying design at Cooper Union and his decision to go to graduate school at Cranbrook. And we talk about his career as a designer, an educator, and a curator. But we spend the bulk of this conversation talking about design history. History is central to Alexander's practice, and we talk about it from a bunch of different angles. We talk about how it relates to contemporary work, how to teach it, and its role in informing our own practices. If you're at all interested in design history, I think you will really enjoy this conversation. I know I came away from it just feeling like I had really learned a lot. Remember, if you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year to receive an exclusive monthly newsletter that has additional content and episode previews. The November newsletter will be going out this week, so if you sign up today, you'll have that next one in your inbox very soon. These memberships really help keep the podcast going, and I just really appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Alexander Tochilovsky. Much about your early career and kind of how you got into all of this. And so let's just start with that and just kind of where your interest in design, or even kind of where you originally learned about graphic design, or that graphic design was something you were interested in.
Yeah. So I was born in Soviet Union and in Odessa, and I left when I was 12 years old, while the country's still Soviet Union, so Odessa now is part of Ukraine. And I had a couple of years of art training there. And when I moved to New York with my family, I had to sort of put art on hold for a while until other things took priority, like learning language, going to school. Eventually, sort of once I felt kind of more settled in to the rhythm of like junior high school, and I'm thinking about college, I kind of came back to art, partially because the high school I was at, which was Morrow, Edward R. Morrow, which has a pretty strong art department. And within the art department, there was a little bit of a design class, which probably was my first foray kind of into my introduction to design. Just as a class, I wouldn't say that I was like enamored by it. It was just like, I tried to take all the art classes. This is one of them. I tried it. It was cool. But I was definitely set more in like the broader kind of art context. And I also found out about Cooper from this high school. And I found out that they had a summer high school program. I did the summer high school program here at Cooper. Fell in love with Cooper Union. I thought this is like the best place in the world. It felt like the right place. And this, I remember like walking through the doors and feeling, wow, this is a really interesting, magical kind of feeling place.
Yeah.
I'd like to be part of this institution.
Yeah.
And was surprised that I got in when I applied. I really didn't think that I had a shot because I came back to art so late. I really didn't feel like I had enough material. I didn't have enough portfolio. The home test was a huge sort of hurdle. I love doing it. I think that's another part of what I really appreciate about Cooper is like the home test, kind of the model of applying, getting in, putting people through the ringer of trying to really suss out the right fit. I love the process of it. I had zero hope of getting in. I was just like, it's just a fluke. I mean, it's just, or when I got in, I was like, oh, it's totally a fluke. Did I make a mistake? But when I got in, after spending kind of the first year doing foundational studies, like most other art schools, there's something I started feeling like sort of a little bit of a pull towards design, but again, like not something that I was like, oh, this is like
Yeah.
the thing for me. I was starting to feel the same pull towards photography too.
Okay. So I have two
Yeah,
questions about that
yeah.
are may or may not be related. You mentioned taking. I'm going to try to make these related questions. You mentioned taking art classes when you were really young
Hmm.
in the Soviet Union, and so I'm kind of curious what those were, or just why you even like did you have an interest in that as
Mm.
a kid, and then two, maybe to connect that when you got back into it and when you were applying to Cooper, what what were you kind of thinking at the time? Were you thinking that you wanted to be an artist? Like, did you kind of have goals at that
Right.
time, and were those maybe related to those early
The
art
initial
classes?
ones. The stuff I did in Soviet Union was like very academic. It was like very much kind
Oh,
of
okay.
the tradition of, I guess, like the residual still of social realism, and it
Oh,
was
interesting.
definitely like a very classical training, like very academic. It's like
Yeah.
you draw from a still life, you
Oh,
draw
yeah.
from a live model, not much concept, not much just technique,
Right.
and talent with technique. That was the formula.
Yeah.
Find talented kids, give them enough technique, and they'll be great artists. Like in sort of in the system of like official artists. So that's kind of all I knew. There's very
Okay.
little that went beyond that. You had classical art, and then there really wasn't modern art, or at least like in my sort of in that bubble that I lived in at the time, there really wasn't anything that went beyond like
Right. Right.
training
Yeah.
and like making things. So it was sort of like a very simple construct that I had in my mind, which once I got to Cooper, completely kind of got flipped on the side,
Yeah.
because when I was applying to Cooper, I think I was applying with this somewhat of a, uh, I guess the home test was the first experience that I had with like making work based on a prompt, making work
Mm.
based on an idea,
Oh, interesting.
rather than just. It's the first time I really was. There were things in high school for sure, but like this is the first time I really felt challenged by making art that wasn't like observational,
Right. Right.
or from your imagination, so to speak. Like it was something where you were given. I remember one prompt was sound and distance. That's all it said, sound and distance. And I remember sitting there and thinking like how do you answer that? Like
Yeah.
in what form is it? What do you do? And but completely enamored by that idea that I had to think of ways to visualize something that's, yeah, it's visual, but like what is my visual for that? And
Right. Right.
it really changed the dynamic for me, because it really it opened up the whole sort of world. And I think, thinking back on that, is probably the first sort of inkling of design kind of
Yeah.
thinking,
It's
because
exactly what I was thinking.
it's the thing that I really gravitated towards. It's like this like here's a prompt and you have to really think about it, and it's fairly open ended. It could go anywhere, and that's the beauty of
Yeah.
what I
Yeah.
really appreciate about design. But it's that same mentality. It's like that same kind of weird starting place, and you just start challenged.
What was that moment like, or when you found yourself gravitating towards design? What was it that kind of finally
Hmm.
grabbed you, or
I think that the thing that clicked for me was like the thinking part.
yeah,
Not so much like, I mean, I do love the aesthetic, but that came kind of secondary, because when I started taking design courses, I really wasn't exposed to as much of the artifacts of graphic design, in the sense that I wasn't really pointed out like this is graphic design and this is like painting. It's just it's there because graphic design is such a part of the
yeah,
visual
yeah,
fabric. You don't really sit up and say, "Oh, this is design." Like
right, right,
it's just your visual context. And what I first, I think, appreciated is the thinking, the sort of the structure of kind of thinking through a problem, and and that really clicked with me. Really, really clicked. I found a really I just liked the time,
yeah,
and I liked what
yeah,
happened in my brain when
yeah,
I was doing that, and that's like the thing that really grabbed me. Um, and at the same time, I have to like around the same time as when I started discovering kind of the visual part of graphic design, like the artifact.
I've been thinking about kind of my own introduction in graphic design and trying to figure out what it was that grabbed me. And I was in high school when I kind of figured it out. And I was also always really interested in art and drew a lot and was always kind of making things. But I'm not sure that it. I don't know if this is true or if I'm kind of like putting this on my background in retrospect. But I when I look back at my interests and what I did as a kid, I wasn't necessarily a good drawer. I could draw, but it wasn't. I don't know if I ever had an ambition to be an artist or thought that that was something I could do. And I've often wondered if graphic design, if it was that kind of process, if it was those systems, if it was, these ideas to make something is what grabbed me equally to the aesthetics and to the artifact. And I definitely loved the artifacts and I loved looking at graphic design, but I'm wondering if it was that kind of what you're talking about. And I'm saying all that to kind of ask how those came together for you, and when did the aesthetics come in, and how did those start to relate to these systems and theories and things that you were thinking about?
Yeah. I mean, I think I definitely relate to that notion of what you just outlined. Like, I feel like I technically wasn't as strong and as good as some of my peers, and I don't know that I ever imagined that I had enough ability to become like an artist, like a fine artist. It's like it's something I liked, but I was never really sure that I had enough to do that. And I think that's why I was so shocked that I got into Cooper, because I thought that the benchmark is so high that like there's no way in hell I would ever stand a chance against like the people. And my first year really was tough because I saw how good my peers were. My first year classmates, and I was like, whoa, like there's no way I could ever really even get
I was
close
the same way my first year.
And I do wonder like that like but there's something obviously that worked, like we got into these institutions that are selective, and so something obviously was there. And I think it maybe is just like that there's a mindset that kind of gets pulled and kind of triggered by sort of this design process. It's not that drastically different from fine art, but I think that there's definitely like a different process. It's a thinking that like the early stages of developing an idea is what really draws people in. I think that there's common ground within sculpture, fine art, photography. Like I think it's like where it goes. I think like the way that things started coming together is I realized how much I didn't see when I was in Soviet Union, how much I wasn't aware of like, the legacy and the culture of the Soviet design, or even like the Russian avant-garde, right? Like the stuff that today is considered one of these most important movements within design and art as well. But I had no idea that existed.
Interesting.
Because like by the time I was in school in the 80s, especially kind of in a smaller city, that really was no longer okay. That aesthetic was very quickly in the 30s sort of put on the shelf, and that was like, too radical, too bourgeois, and then everything social realism kind of took over, and so the generation that I was growing up with was cut off from that completely. And I had to basically come to New York and go to school in New York City to realize how much had been going on at the time in 1920s.
Right.
And that aesthetic really resonated with me, partially just for, like just I guess what's the best way of saying it? Not nationalist, but cultural sort of like sharing cultural heritage with that aesthetic felt like, oh wow, this is mine. I have a closer relationship to it, even if I didn't know that existed, but I felt proud of having, being part of this culture that had this amazing history there. So I felt kind of an affinity towards it on an emotional level, but also on an aesthetic level. I found it's amazingly concise and amazingly strong visually. So that's like when the visual part started kind of coming into it, and kind of So the thinking and the visual sort of forms of Russian avant-garde started to kind of get me pulling me more and more into the world of design.
This is interesting. I don't mean to kind of take a sharp turn away from kind of the trajectory of your career, but something I was really interested in talking to you about was design history and kind of your interest in design history, and it seems like it's a really big part of your practice. And I was kind of curious where that came in, and it sounds like it came in at like a very personal level. Like this is maybe where the kind of interest in design history in general, not just kind of Soviet Russian design history. So did kind of finding that history and your personal connection to it kind of open up into design history in general, or like how did kind of studying the history become so important to your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think like it's interesting. I haven't really thought about it in that regard, but definitely feeling like there's a gap, like there's a hole in my knowledge somehow, like that. It was just strange, kind of to find yourself like, whoa, how did I not know? Like, I grew up in a country that made this work, and like, what's that's so weird that. But you understand like the kind of logic why that might have been the case, but feeling like you're filling in, and being fascinated by something and being like surprised by not knowing that and really wanting to fill that gap, and I think that probably maybe started. Again, like it's interesting. I haven't really thought about it in that way, but it feels very much like that's the beginning of where I started to get interested in these ideas around the history of design. Stuff that like, oh, I don't know something. That's weird. I should know. It feels like I should know that. Let me go and find that out. And then kind of a succession of these finding these holes in my knowledge and being just curious to fill that knowledge so that like, it doesn't, I don't want to have that hole. It seems kind of an important thing to know. Let me go investigate that. Let me find that. I think that along with discovering the Lubalin Center when I was a student, that happened like between my first and second year.
Oh, okay.
That just surrounded by some of these artifacts that I kept kind of stumbling across were curious because it was funny because it's like, finding gaps in knowledge, was I think a big motivating factor, and then just finding things that were just curious, just like things that didn't have a context, and I really kind of felt I didn't understand what they were in a way. Like I would find something that, because my understanding of graphic design by that point was fairly rudimentary, so seeing like an object that I really couldn't place anywhere just made me like struggle, like what is it? Like, I need to understand this, and sort of like that led me down a rabbit hole, many rabbit holes of design history, and I think like those two things of like knowing that I don't know things, and like it would be nice to have, like not a comprehensive ever knowledge, but definitely like filling in the gaps, and then also just dumbfounded by like an object, and it's like I don't get it. What is it? Let me figure out what this is so I can feel somehow secure about knowledge of what. Now I understand this thing. Okay, cool. Like I think part of it is also driven by immigrating and then knowing that I don't know, and like I don't have the same context. I mean, it happens all the time now too. Like less so, I guess, as you get older, but certainly things that like someone will mention a movie, right, that they grew up with watching, and you're like, what? Like, I feel like I've definitely like filled in like Goonies for like something like that, like camp movies that my generation would have watched, but there's certain movies that just escaped completely. I had no time. I wasn't here. Like, and then when you're older, you have no interest in seeing those things. But it's that kind of feeling of being an immigrant and assimilating into a culture, and knowing that there's just a chunk of time and space and knowledge that you won't be able to reconcile. You don't have that, and being comfortable, as a teenager in a society where it feels like you don't really want to stand out too much or be different enough, because you don't know something. You kind of have to work double time. Like, okay, I gotta make sure that I'm up on these things. I gotta know what they're talking about. Like, I need to fit in so that I don't feel like excluded from the stuff and completely trivial things. But there's this tendency of like I gotta fit in.
Right.
I need to know the culture. And I think like that stays with you because you know that you're always behind.
I feel like I was the same way, especially in regards to design history. The undergrad that I went to, they had a design history class, but it didn't go too deep on anything. It was a survey class that was just kind of very quick through. And I remember feeling at the time like I was missing a lot of things, and I feel like that's kind of when my interest in design history started, in feeling like the history that I was being shown wasn't the full history.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious why you felt like you needed to know these things,
Mm-hmm.
or
Mm-hmm.
the impulse to categorize or to fill in these gaps, and did it come from, or did it have any kind of influence on the work that you were making, or were you seeing connections? Were you seeing, kind of studying these things, filtering into the work that you were doing at, either as a student, and then even when you went on to work as a designer? How did that history kind of filter in?
Yeah. Like I never formally had a history of graphic design class. It
Oh,
was it
interesting.
was it was offered at the time when I was here. Somehow it never fit my schedule. Like
Yeah.
it's something circumstantial where I was actually like really curious and I really was interested in taking that class. I saw stuff that was like I saw what was going on in that class and was like really curious about it, and it just never really worked out for not just probably circumstances. But so I never really had even like the survey, and
Oh,
so whatever
interesting.
the
Yeah.
history that I knew was whatever came sort of filtered through the courses, like you teachers dropping names,
Right.
like blah blah blah, this da da da,
Yeah.
piecemeal. And I think that was also like knowing like, oh, okay, so I got like three things here and a couple of things here. There's got to be like more, like
Right.
holes, big
Right.
holes. And then interning at the Lubalin Center, which I did pretty much throughout the. So I started between my first and second year, and I stayed interning for the next couple of years, almost 3 years, not like
Okay.
throughout the year, just like coming in a few days a week and just kind of helping out here and there and helping out with a lot of exhibitions that were going on during that time. Being exposed to sort of these very sort of narrow themes within design, that I think sort of was my introduction to like the field of like kind of scholarship around graphic
Right. Right.
design. I One of the shows I worked on was the Paul Shaw and Peter Bain's Black Letter exhibition, the type
Oh,
of national
yeah.
identity that
Yeah.
happened, I think '98, and that was fascinating to me because it was like it's a show about graphic design, but it's such a narrow, such a specific
Right.
framework, but also with a lot of substance. It was like
Hmm.
about the black letter type, but like with all the ensuing kind of baggage. So working on something like that allowed me to kind of understand like how deep and how vast this kind of stuff is. And even though I didn't have a survey, I had kind of like a very small snippet of like a very deep kind of research and
Right. Yeah.
how time consuming and how intense it could be. So I had these like kind of weird, I guess like entry points into this thing of kind of the bigger graphic design. But to your question, I think I didn't connect it to my practice ever really, and
Oh,
I didn't really
interesting.
see the connection that it could have had. I think in a way because I really didn't understand like the field of the history of design in the sense that I might have if I had taken that kind of the survey
Oh,
course.
interesting. Yeah.
So I always was just I think what I was thinking about mostly when I was doing my own design work, it was just kind of like thinking about what I was doing and solving sort of the particular problems that you're solving in the assignments, and then seeing, I guess, the connections I was making was more to the contemporary work.
Okay.
So like
Yeah.
annuals, like Type
Oh,
Directors
right.
Club
Right.
or Art
Right.
Directors Club, like whatever, like 97, 98, 99. At the time, it's the Type Directors annual exhibitions was happening in Cooper, so every summer I would like see that show, and I felt like this very strong kind of pressure for trying to be as good as the work that I was seeing
Yeah.
and seeing the gap in quality. Like my work is here, and this work I'm seeing is
Right.
like
Yep.
so much more. And it was definitely tricky kind of to, because if you just want it to be just as good as that work, but knowing that you're still behind, so that's the connection in a way to my practice that I was making, to something that much more immediate, something much,
Yeah.
much, much closer. And I really was drawn to the historical stuff, but I didn't see it as relating to my work that I was doing. I always felt them kind of sort of not even tangential, just not even
Yeah.
parallel. They were just like this world of graphic design history and this world of making. What I've come to realize now is I've through sort of the work that I've been doing and the time that I'm engaged as a curator in the collection, now I've reestablished the links. And it took
Oh,
me kind of, it took a weird trajectory for me to get there, to now understand the full impact of understanding graphic design and understanding the history and understanding the mechanics behind it. I can see how influential it is to the practice.
can you talk about that a
Yeah,
little bit? And you don't have to talk about it in relationship to your own work, but
yeah,
just in general, because this is something that I think about a lot. I haven't articulated it enough for myself, and so I'm kind of
mm-hmm.
asking you to do it so I can try to figure it out for
Sure.
myself, because it's interesting to me that you didn't take the design history class that was offered when you were a student here, and at the schools that I teach at, design history classes are optional
Mm-hmm.
for the most part. I
Right.
don't think they're required, and
Mm-hmm.
something about that feels wrong to me. Like design history feels like something that should be required for
Mm-hmm.
every design student. And I I intellectually see the connection in my own work and in the work of students, and not just as a reference of, oh, you're doing something, talking to a student, you're doing something that looks like this. You should look at this designer, or
Mm-hmm.
this is
Mm-hmm.
someone you should know about. It seems like those connections are deeper, and I haven't fully articulated what those are, but I know they're there, and I would love to kind of hear
Yeah.
you talk about them, especially like your work here in the Lubalin Center. That's such a collection of design history
Mm-hmm.
too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, like I think like what I would say. I mean, there's a lot that I could say about this because it's something that I've been thinking for several years now. It's something that's been really, really become something really important to my. I guess this is my practice now. This
Right.
is really
Yeah.
sort of like what I
Exactly.
do. I mean, I think one. Um, I think there's something a little bit problematic with the terminology. I think like for a graphic designer, for a graphic design student to take a course that's called graphic design history, given what we expect of designers and what we sort of are asking of them, like as soon as you put that label graphic design history, there's something that kind of switches off. There's
Right.
something that's
Right.
like, oh, it's history,
Right.
not relevant. I think that there's
Yeah.
this
You're
really
exactly right.
strange kind of thing, which isn't the same that happens in art. Like, so if you're an artist, like most of us having gone through art schools, even if we study design, we're exposed to art history.
Yep.
Artists, I think, have a very different relationship to it because that's their practice, that's their whole field. Like, they don't necessarily feel that somehow it's old.
Right. Yeah.
It's something that you're part of. It's your sort of. I think within graphic design, there's a stronger emphasis, and this is just a theory. Like this is something that I kind of see, and feels, and I don't know how true this is, but I definitely feel that there's like some substance to it, and that we're expected to make a lot of new things. We're always kind of expected to make,
That's
like
interesting.
I just kind of think about like every project that I've ever worked on. Like no one's ever asked me to like do some like they need a new thing, right? They come to you because there's something that they have isn't working anymore. Something that they need a new logo. They need whatever. Like there's this constant shift towards the future. It's like it's all about tomorrow and like the
Yeah. Yeah.
longevity and there's a shelf life, but then at some point we'll have to redesign it. When you bring because it's such a strong emphasis, like a fine artist, like a painter, doesn't necessarily set out every day to make the new thing, new. No one's like they're making something. Like
Yeah.
the mode is rooted in their making and the thinking and like what's motivating them. It's not, of course, by default it's new, but
Yeah.
they don't necessarily, I don't feel like there's this incessant pressure of like, make the new thing, make the new thing, what's the cool thing, what's this new thing? Well, I think when graphic design is so much kind of part of this new future trajectory, and you put history into it, it's at odds. I think that there's this like strong tension. Like, why should I care about this stuff?
Yeah.
If my client's not asking me to delve into Paul Rand, like
Right.
they're just
Right.
asking me for a new logo. Like maybe they want it to be as good as Paul Rand's, but they're really asking me for something, and I'm gonna just like I think our perspective as graphic designers, not all, but like I think that there's this emphasis like we look in a very narrow space
Yeah.
of like what else is going on now, what are the other studios doing, what's cool, you know, like and
Right.
we kind of stay within today, and we want to be like tomorrow, but like we're kind of like we don't
That's
think about
really
yesterday,
interesting.
and I find that that's uh, a huge problem because like the more I've spent time here in the archive, the more I've spent time with these materials, the more open-minded that I've been able to allow myself to be, the more I've realized how relevant everything is and how
Hmm.
much all of this stuff still matters. You know, I think the problem I find, if I can try to articulate, the problem that I find is because graphic design is so rooted in the visual and it's so um, conditioned by the importance of the aesthetic. You know, it's
Yeah.
like, and then we get judged on the aesthetic, right? We critique the aesthetic. In the making, we spend a lot of time like moving stuff around. You know, like this would look better on the left, or you know, this feels off balance. Like, why these colors? Like, there's such a strong emphasis on the final communication being completely in sort of the aesthetic. Uh, we overemphasize the aesthetic over the thinking and the
Yeah.
making,
Yeah.
which every designer knows that it's not just the final form. They spent weeks, days, months, years developing this project, and it looks the way it looks because of all of these things that went into it. Like,
Hmm.
but when we move from that, once the project is done, once it's out there in the world, yeah, we can see like the concept. We can kind of see why it's clever. We can see why it's interesting, why it resonates, but it's still about the thing. You know, it's
Yeah.
still about the object, and so we overemphasize the aesthetics, and we overemphasize the aesthetic to such a degree. I find that we never really delve into everything that's behind it,
Yeah.
and oftentimes we just don't have the access point to it.
I think you're exactly right. And that's something I've thought about a lot. And I've never taught a design history class, so I'm only speaking from experience as someone who loves design history, someone who has taken design history classes, and someone who teaches students who have taken design history classes, and how I see them kind of respond to it is that design history, this is a blanket statement, often does get kind of boiled down to just a collection of artifacts. And there's no story, no context, no um, relationship or theory
Mm-hmm.
about why these objects look the way they do, or why we even consider these objects as part of the design history canon. And so I think about the classes that I had taken, they were all just, it was slides of images,
Mm-hmm.
and it was kind of like, this was the style at this time, and then this designer did this new thing without any of that context of what was happening in the world at the time.
Yeah.
What new technology was created that made these things look a different way, or what was happening in the culture or in politics that prompted this. And I wonder if how bringing those things in, how talking about process and
Mm-hmm.
and wider history could change kind of our relationship
Yeah.
to it.
Yeah. Like I, again, I think like I the actually the first class I ever taught by myself was a design history class,
Oh, nice.
and which is strange, and I haven't taught design history since. Although I've been
Okay.
really curious and like would love to sort of like try it in a kind of a more contemporary space. I mean, I teach it sort of in a way as part of like the job, you know, sort
Yeah,
of
yeah,
the
yeah.
gateway to the material. It feels like it's teaching design history, but not in a formal way. I mean, I think like the trick is like you have 15 weeks and you have to like jump through,
Right,
run through a lot of history, and it doesn't leave a lot of room for the
right.
context. But I think it's essential. I think like we have to have like like the ideology behind a lot of the work, and the thinking is often like more interesting and more important as a takeaway rather than like the like the final sort of aesthetic. Like Swiss design to me is like the perfect example of how little we understand really of why it looks the way it looks.
Right.
And the thinking that went behind it. It seems for most of us that are exposed to that aesthetic, it's like, oh, it's an aesthetic. It's like, it's very clean, it's very minimal, and then like you find like the formula is, you have a certain narrow palette of fonts, typefaces that you can pick from, and the aesthetic is very minimal, like pared down, and that's sort of like, okay, so it's about minimalism. Swiss design is about minimalism, and yeah, it is about sort of like a distilled kind of a simple visual presentation, but there's a reason why it's so simple, because the ideology was so important. The objectivism rooted with, that underpinned the entire Swiss movement with Swiss design is what caused them to go towards the minimal aesthetic. Right. It wasn't like that they explored the range of visual choices and they're like, we just like the more minimal stuff. They did the minimal stuff because of what the thinking led them to.
Right.
It was the perfect answer to what their aims were. And now we just see the final form. It's like, okay, it's minimal, so I'm going to do something like in the Swiss style.
Yeah.
And that's just wrong in a way. It feels really, really wrong to me. Like this is just, it's such a disservice to the Swiss movement to just make it into minimal. It's not minimal. There's lots of other minimal work. 1920s, De Still, like constructivist, could be said minimal. Like why this has now become like the shorthand for it, and we really miss out. And I really feel as a graphic designer still, I think that design students and designers would be better served by being kind of shown and given the context why the Swiss style exists the way it does, like what made it that. Because I think like if we understand what drove it to get to that place, I think you can use the same ideas, you can use the same principles, and apply them in not necessarily a minimal way. Like you can apply that logic in very different ways. I feel like the mutability of that is what is fascinating about design history. Like the fact that if you understand the stuff kind of in a more holistic way, you could move it into different aesthetics. It doesn't have to stay. Like I'm a fan of like minimal work. It's something that I like as a visual expression of my own sensibilities. But there are things that I could appreciate about like certain work, and also at the same time not appreciate like the visual, like the shorthand. But if I understand like the stuff behind it, I could make something that is visually something very different. It doesn't have to be minimal necessarily. Like it's a bit vague kind of in sort of this explanation, but I think that like for me, like I guess like this is maybe more of a better example. Is like I can find something that visually is something I hate, like just flat down, like just something that's just not amazingly in line with my sort of sensibilities. But if I'm open-minded and if I can sit down with this object and dig through it, I can find something really useful for myself.
Right. I think what you're talking about is exactly what I see with my own students. I know I was guilty of this as an undergrad and in my early design career of kind of taking, getting really interested in or getting really obsessed with a particular moment in design history and just copying that look, just, taking that, putting it on this new thing. And I can always tell with my students kind of what they're looking at often. And I have a whole body of work from undergrad that was done in various styles that I was interested in that were just completely not appropriate to the context or to the thing that I was supposed to be designing for. But it was like, oh, I'm really into this style right now. Let me just put it on this poster that I'm doing, even though there's no relation. And I think kind of what you're talking about with kind of understanding the thinking and the ideas and the systems is a way to start to kind of move beyond that a little bit. And I'm, to kind of connect this to teaching, I'm curious how you kind of approach this with your own students when, whether you see things like that or how you kind of start to bring in other processes or systems or ideas for your students to kind of move beyond these kind of surface level ideas.
Yeah, that's something that I think is always going to be part of how I think it's just inevitable for students to be drawn to things and just try to kind of mimic them.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a courage thing. I think that's definitely like something that happens in certain classes, and I think it's like there's a sort of there's always like the right way and the wrong way to doing that. I think that there's definitely upsides to just like copying. Well, on the upside, I think that what it does is at least allows someone to dwell with some amount of material, and like I think like maybe unpack it a little bit more. Hope one hopes that kind of like allows a little bit more insight into it. The downside is that it does kind of overemphasize like the aesthetics, like, oh, this is like David Carson, so like this is that world, and I'm just gonna like take the cues that I see, and I'm just going to try to apply them to the thing that I'm working on without the context. And that usually feels like a wrong fit. It definitely feels like there's some tension there. Not good tension. But I think like hopefully, what I try to do with my students, like I'm teaching more studio courses now, in like as an instructor, like that's more of the space that I occupy. But I try to bring in examples of material as much as I can because I have the access to the collection here. So it's a really easy thing for me to do is bring students here to the Lubalin Center or bring material out to the class. What I try to do is kind of what I do in general. So I kind of put my curator hat. When I do that with my students, I really try to explain as much as possible a little bit of like what the connections might be to them, like how to like unpack some of this work, and really not to get sucked into just like, oh, this is the filter. It's like it's not styles and flashcards of filters. It's like it's not like here's the humorous Tibor Kalman kind of work. Here's the David Carson kind of thing, and here's like the Swiss stuff, and like it's not just a deck of cards. Right. Like it's not like something that you just choose which thing that you do. Although I'm sure there are deck of cards that like unpack this history. But there's more nuance to it, and it's more about the making of it, like and kind of embodying something. And the beauty of having the artifact, and I think that's another kind of hurdle, is like it's very difficult for designers and especially design students to get hands on these things. I think like when we were in school, it was a little easier. It's like you can go and just get these things. Kind of you could feel them, touch them, and then I think we started like buying them and acquiring these things. I think it's becoming a little bit more detached because there's so much stuff online.
Right. Yeah.
We don't need to go seek out the thing. It's like, oh, I can just Google it.
Right.
Like what I try to do is bring the artifacts so they can hold it, feel it, and then just slow down with it. Just like kind of sit with it and see if we can kind of unlock it. And really suspend that initial maybe gut reaction. I think there's always there's a certain level, and I think it happens with every generation. It's like when even I think there's some filter, of the things that you teachers kind of try to expose you to. It feels there's always like it feels like a little bit of a generational step. Like I remember myself as a student, and the references that you teachers make would often feel a little old-timey. There's like a little bit of like, okay, cool, I see that, I can understand, I appreciate that you're bringing this in, but this is a little old now, And I think that there's it's inevitable that happens, and I completely embrace that my references that I might be bringing to my students might feel old-fashioned to them, but I try to really sort of work with that. It's like, fine, no, it is old-fashioned, that's fine, but let's see it for what it is. Let's kind of like let's find value in it. It's like you're here, I'm here, we have time together. We could just waste the time. You can just sort of sit here and not really get anything from it, or we can get something really useful out of this. Here's some ways to kind of think about these things in a more holistic way, where you will find relevance to it. You know,
Right.
and then trust me, it's not me telling you that this is the only thing, that this is the the gospel, that this is the truth, that this is how design works. But here's an artifact, and if you find the right perspective, and that's kind of what I'm dwelling on a lot, is like the perspective, giving the students the perspective. Here's the perspective on how to see this thing and find something super useful.
I think, yeah, I think you're exactly right, and I think a place where you actually do a really good job of that here is on the flat file series. Is that still going on?
Yeah, it's slow.
Okay.
We're
Because
catching on it,
I
yeah.
thought those kind of short little, almost like showcases with little essays, do such a great job of that, because they show these images in kind of really beautiful high res full screen. You can really see them, and then you scroll down a little bit and there's a really kind of thoughtful short essay that's never very long, but talks a little bit about how it looks, a little bit about where it came from, a little bit of the designer, but then also adds to that a little bit, talks about kind of where it came from, why this might be interesting. So that's not really a question other than a compliment, but I think kind of what you're saying, you're doing a good job at.
Yeah.
But I think that's like a really nice way to kind of do that too. Is and it also then gets your collection out.
Yeah,
into
I mean,
the world.
I really like, in a way, it's not something I feel like we own. I mean, like, what I'm really hopeful for is to allow these to be little kind of case studies, these little models.
Right.
It's
Case study is a great word for it.
Like as a teacher, you always model things, and it's this passing of information. It's like because it's not arithmetic. It's not like an exact science. Like, you just want to model the behavior, and then let the students excel you.
Right.
Because they're like, they're younger. Like, you just want to show them like the mechanics of it, and then let them own the mechanics and do whatever they can and will do with it. So in the same way, what I'm hoping that the flat file series does is just allows a glimpse into, like, here's a piece, and just here's some things that could bubble up, if you just allow that to happen. I think so. I'm hoping that what it does is that makes people look at the things, even the things that they already own. Like the stuff, like, we designers have, we curate everything, right? Like, it's inevitable, like that. I can walk into every designer's apartment and like find cool things,
Yep.
It's a given. It's 100% a guarantee. But what is it other than just like artifacts that are done almost in the same aesthetic reason? We bought them for the aesthetic. We like how they look on our walls. Like, we want to be identified with them. It's amazing. It's awesome. I'm all for that. But what else? Like, it doesn't stop there. It doesn't have to stop there. And I think, like, the things that we already have, or the things we already own, like, let's pull them off the shelf.
Yeah.
Like, pull it off the wall and like flip through it. Like, how many people own the Vignelli map? I mean, like it's countless designers. It's like, it's like a rite of passage. You have to buy the Vignelli map, right? Not everyone, but a lot of how many people have actually like sat with it and looked at it and deconstructed it and really sort of got something out of it, and asked, even more importantly, like, questioned it, right? Like, I think that there's this problem within design history where it's almost unquestionable. Like, if it's given to you in the design history, you accept it and you just take it. Like, this is the good stuff.
Right.
Who said it's the good stuff? Right? Like, not that it's not the good stuff, but shouldn't we at least like have some filter to it? We should have some power to interrogate that and ask, why does it work the way it does? And like, who said it's the best of the best? Like, the idea of canon in canonization is deeply problematic, but like, it's this kind of stuff. Like, why do we have what we have? I bought this thing. It's on my shelf. It's on my wall. I clearly feel something for it. How am I going to make it useful? I want to be a better designer. Like, we have these things already, like, in our shelves. And like I said, like, I'm guilty of as much of this as everyone else, because we just like these things. We love how they look. We put them in our house. It makes us feel good. But often enough, I think we should just wake up and say, I'm just gonna spend some time with
I
this thing
love that.
and just like dig into it and like get something out of it. I think like the core for me is like being selfish, right? Like I think it's almost like um, I don't know if it's like a stigma, but it's almost like you can't be selfish. You know, there's like I don't know. I'm not sure if I can articulate this in a healthy kind of clear sort of way, but I think that there's something that like yeah, I'm gonna struggle to kind of frame this, but I find like we have to be really selfish. You know, like selfish and like why does the Vignelli map? How will it make my design career better? Right, like just the fact that I bought it. Okay, so I spent $100 for it. It's a status symbol, right? It means like, look at me. I'm a designer. That I have these things. It's your badge. You know, it's like it's something that you wear to show others that you're a serious designer, kind of, right? Like a little bit of that.
Right.
So sure, fine, let's do that. That's great. Like we keep these things, but as a designer, like be selfish and use that other than a status symbol. Use that to improve yourself as a designer. I really wholeheartedly believe in that Vignelli map that hangs on a lot of designers' walls can make them stronger designers if they understand something behind it.
Yeah.
The context, the
Yeah.
story, the reason why it failed, more importantly, right? Like, it did fail. It did fail. It didn't succeed in the thing that it was designed to do. You know, it
Right.
didn't work as a map. It's a beautiful piece of design. At the same time, I find it deeply flawed because of the decisions and some of the mechanics that went into it. But if we know that, and if
Yeah.
we tackle it from that point, we can be stronger graphic designers.
I think that's great. I actually really like that idea a lot. And I'm going to ask a question that might seem like a complete left turn. I'm hoping it connects in my in projecting how I think you might answer this is going to connect, because we did skip over a decent amount of your career and your background, but I did want to talk a little bit about your time at Cranbrook and kind of what you were hoping to get out of that, but also to try to connect it to this. Cranbrook holds a really interesting place in design history, I feel like. And in a way, I think it's a bit underappreciated for its contribution to design history and design discourse in general. And I just talked to Andrew Blauvelt, who probably is going to be the episode right before yours. And so talking to him, Cranbrook has been on my mind again. But I'm kind of curious how kind of all of these things we're talking about, how Cranbrook kind of fits into this, or the influence of that of your time there kind of fits into your thinking now.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I like that sort of tangent. It definitely is a good left turn.
Okay.
I think like because I've been kind of thinking about the Cranbrook too, like just sort of thinking about my time there, and like it's like everything in hindsight starts to make more sense than when you're
Right,
kind of
yeah.
right in the midst of it. And Cranbrook is definitely like a unique institution, unique place where everyone's experience there is like completely different and strange and kind of nebulous. And I think it does take some time for that to kind of sink in. It's not fair to me to say like how that might compare to someone else's experience in another institution, because that's the only experience that I have with that institution. But because of the sort of the strangeness that Cranbrook has, that like just the structure, lack of classes, lack of real sort of instruction, grades, etc., like all the things that make an institution seem like an institution. But it does, in that uniqueness, I think like I've been kind of thinking about like what did I like? Why did I go there? What did I get out of it? Was it good? Like was it a good thing to do? Was it? I mean, I think like in the hindsight, I never questioned that that it was that it could even seem like not a good thing. Like it was always something that felt right. From kind of the same thing happened when I walked to Cranbrook. The first day I worked into Cooper, I was like, oh, feels right. There's something here that feels right. And I stepped on the Cranbrook campus. I was like, oh, this feels right. There's something here that like resonates with me. It's like, okay, let's just go
Yeah.
with that. You know,
Yeah.
it's kind of
Yeah.
this like if it feels right,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
a
I know
big part
exactly
of
what you
it.
mean.
And then there's definitely kind of the feel that there is this legacy there. You know, I think it's kind of hard to escape the history of the Eames, you know,
Mm-hmm.
the Saarinen, like it's the and
Yep.
then the McCoys, like it's a big kind of part of the fabric there, and it's in kind of inescapable. It's always there. It's always kind of quite visible in many places. So the history that's there is something also that kind of drew me. I think that the fabric of how the institution is woven is very much kind of in this kind of legacy of these important individuals. And because I was coming to Cranbrook after about 5 years of working as a graphic designer, it was sort of like I already kind of been going through kind of the growing pains of being a
Right.
graphic
Right.
designer. And I think like the context that led me to Cranbrook is a bit of disillusionment.
Yeah.
You know, I really
Yeah.
wasn't happy with where I was. Uh, just in terms of my own output. Like
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
wasn't
Yeah.
happy with the work I was making, and I didn't really know what to do with how to sort of steer the
Yeah,
ship.
that's the same for me in grad school. So I think I was 6 or 7 years,
Mm-hmm.
but it was the same thing. I felt like it was not going in the
Crisis.
direction
We're a
I
little bit
wanted.
of a
Yeah,
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 sort of like what's going on,
right.
like yeah, and we do take ourselves very seriously. Like, oh my God, this is not how it's supposed
Yeah,
to be.
yeah,
And I do wonder. I mean, like I don't know if you've had this experience. You know, if many people sort of go through that. I mean, I imagine a lot of designers around that kind of
yeah,
five
yeah,
year mark, 3 to 6 year mark, maybe
yeah, yeah,
hit that crisis. I think maybe most just kind of power through. You know,
yeah,
you just
yeah,
change jobs
yeah,
maybe, and some kind of do the grad school route. But it feels like that 5 year sort of stretch is like where it
yeah,
feels like you get the itch. You're like, oh, I got to do something about
yeah, yeah,
this.
yeah.
I mean, I
Exactly.
thought I don't know if it was the same for you, but like when I was thinking about grad school, like I really was thinking of it's either grad school for design or no design. Like I really had this kind of fork.
Yeah, I don't think I would have said that
Mm-hmm.
at the time, but in retrospect, I think that is kind of how I felt about it. And because I went to grad school, even kind of subconsciously thinking that I was going to grad school to become a design critic or a design writer or a design educator, that I was still in the world,
Mm-hmm.
but thinking that I was not going to be a graphic
I
designer
see.
anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it didn't really turn out that way, and I kind of grad school ended up reminding me what I liked about the design process,
Mm-hmm.
and I kind of realized that I don't want to give that up. But yeah, I don't think I would have known that at the time, or kind of that design grad school
Yeah.
or no design, but I do feel like that's kind of what it
Mm-hmm.
where my head was.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like my experience was not completely not the opposite, but I think like there's something that I kind of felt like I like what the motivation was like for me. It's like either I completely give up design or I get into grad school and I will just become a different kind of designer. Like I
Right,
felt like it
right.
was just going to be like this next gear
Yeah,
that I
yeah, yeah.
needed.
Yeah, it was kind of like that
And
too.
in a funny way, like what I find now is like having gone through that experience and having like sort of re-entered into kind of the design world, my trajectory has been to pull away from design, much
Mm,
more from the making of design.
yeah,
Even though I went to grad school to just completely become a much better designer, what I thought would happen, I've moved further and further away. The more I've kind of been out of Cranbrook, I'm making less design, even though that's the whole
yeah,
reason I went to
yeah,
it. But I think like the dynamic that happened there is what allowed me now and sort of it set me on this trajectory. I think it reminded me, like you said, like it reminded me of certain things. It reminded me
yeah,
about sort of greater context in a way. You know, it's like it did reinvigorate my draw towards the making. I still completely I love the mental space of problem solving is like the too easy of a term, but I do love that space. I
yeah,
do love kind of thinking and sitting and kind of struggling through that. But at the same time, I also think about the mechanics, and I've the history part really came back in full force,
yeah.
and that's I think what led me, the experience I had at Cranbrook is what led me to do the things I do now and to realize this connection between the historical material.
That's my almost my experience exactly, and kind of how I now have seen my career post grad school and kind of where I see it going or where I want it to go. I don't think that my ultimate goals or my career goals or even the work I'm doing now, honestly, is quote unquote traditional graphic design. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not that interested in the, kind of working with clients, the kind of design as service, as, that sounds weird to say, but
Mm-hmm.
even though I do that, that's not where my interest is. It is moving away from practicing design, and if I would really crystallize it, I think it's really in teaching. Teaching is really where I feel like all of these things I'm interested in come together. And so it has the writing component, it has the history component, it has these kind of conversations, it
Mm-hmm.
has it has the kind of theory and the criticism, and it has actual designing, whether it's kind of designing presentations or
Yeah.
syllabi and just kind of class things. Like that's where everything kind of comes together for me. And so I say all that because I kind of want to ask you a little bit. I have just a couple questions to wrap up, but to connect it back to Cranbrook and your experience. The last time that we talked, you had mentioned that you felt like you learned a lot from Elliot, who I also talked to,
Mm-hmm.
about teaching.
Yeah.
And so I would love to just hear a little bit more
Yeah.
about that and kind of how that has affected, you know, your work
Yeah, yeah.
since.
Again, like it's sort of it's this like weird thing that I didn't go there to learn to
Right.
teach. I didn't go there to become a design teacher, and that look, and then that's now my sort of career. But I think what happened is I was in an environment where this sort of conversation about the making was so deep and so nuanced that kind of just really stuck. And the mechanics of how Elliot structured the program when I was there, and I'm sure it's gotten sort of even tighter, even stronger since I've left. Um, Elliot's sort of a tinker. I think he fine tunes everything sort of
Mm,
to a certain degree, year to year, the dynamic changes. But I think he's got a good sense of reflecting on the practice and then sort of
right.
stepping in and like modifying things as needed. And that's something that I really saw in his practice, and that's something that I've kind of retained as well. This idea of sort of introspection, and kind of like looking at like the sort of the good dose of micromanagement of like, all right,
Yeah.
so okay, so what is going on, and okay, so here's like a little bit of a weakness. We can shore that up. And that's the same kind of principle, I guess, in a way, like that it was applied to the critiques. I think like the way Eliot structured the critiques was very useful for me, and understanding the work that I was making better, the understanding kind of the the I guess in some ways sort of the mechanics of design, but also really allow me to understand like how to teach in a really interesting way. I think like I structured my critiques in this very similar fashion because I think they're very effective. At least in the courses that I've taught in the studio courses, I think some of the things that I've really emphasized is group critique and kind of you know
Mm,
the participation of the students and also at the same time less participation by the maker. So
right.
it's really about us looking at something. Elliot would call it sort of the cold read. Usually like the work that you see in the critique space is stuff that people are tinkering in their studio, but like you don't really see it. You don't really like you
Yeah.
don't share it with everyone for 2 weeks, and then you see like the slightly more final version of it. This is new stuff. Stuff happens, like you come in, like, wow, I've never seen that. What is it? Let's talk about it. Like you
Mm,
have no context, no entry point into it, and you have to struggle, kind of like find what it is that you can suss out of it. And I think that's a really good effective space for students to be in because it confronts them, and they really have to contend with it. They really have to contend
right.
with it on a very sort of nuanced level, and it's really helped me teach. It's really helped me kind of. I really believe in that methodology, and I think like or an aspect of methodology because I think it really it gets them to care. And I
Right.
think like one
Yeah.
thing that I often realized sort of in the environment that Elliot kind of set up, the environment that Cranbrook set up. Elliot's part of, like is in a way, like you can call it like a product of Cranbrook as
Yeah,
well.
yeah,
So it's sort of built in there, but I think like one of the strongest things that came away from Cranbrook is like realizing how much your contribution, one's contribution in the critique to other people's work, like how you talk about other people's work, the things that you find in other people's work, especially
yeah.
the
That's
critical
interesting.
component of like the weakness in the work is often the same weaknesses that you struggle with.
Right.
What allows is this bit of mirroring, like when you see something. It's not like I don't think this happens 100% of the time, but being able to confront a piece of work that's new, something you've never seen, and being critical and finding the things that work, but especially the things that don't work, I find that intuitively, subconsciously, we're drawn to the things that we struggle with in our
That's
own
interesting.
work. And so we're able to then like problem solve through other people's work, our own
That's
sort of
really
issues.
interesting.
And I find that like, and I encourage my students to do that because I remind them like, unpack these things. You're going to be drawn to something like, you're not them. You didn't make this and you didn't struggle with the flaw, but if you can find that flaw, that means there's something that you're working through possibly as well.
Yeah.
And in a way, you're helping yourself. You're kind of
Right.
you're giving yourself more by critiquing someone else's work. And so there's these kind of mechanics that I really think are super super effective, and that's something that I've really admire about the time that I spent at Cranbrook, and I admire about the structure that Elliot set up is that it does allow this kind of deeper investigation, and it's really like the same thing in a way that I do with the like flat file or anything that I do in the archive is I think this trajectory and that time that I spent at Cranbrook and this kind of very sort of rigorous investigation of other people's work is what I apply to older work. I
Right.
just use the same lens, and then it's kind of funny. I mean, like it's really strange. Again, like not to sort of ping back to what we were talking about before, but like I find it very strange that like we designers go through this like rigorous process of making the work that we make. We obsess over it. The
Yeah.
art directors, it's like you want the client to get the best thing, and like it's this really like serious struggle and a lot of work. And then when we look at other work, we don't apply
Right.
that same
Right.
rigor. Like
Right.
it's almost like, okay, so we can do it when we do the work ourselves, but then like it's everything else is absolved of that. Why? It shouldn't. And like
Yeah.
who has time? One, right? Like it's
Right.
like I'm not gonna go to MoMA and like stand up in front of Vignelli Map for 2 hours and like critique it. But why not? Ultimately, kind of why not? Like,
Yeah.
and I think that's the process of Cranbrook and having been to Cranbrook after grad school, after working, going to grad school after working, has allowed me to just reconnect with that idea of like, here's the rigorous kind of thing, and entering into the job of being the curator in this collection with that baggage that I came away from Cranbrook. It just was natural, just to kind
Right.
of like it started bleeding in. So I really think that Cranbrook is this really interesting, magical kind of space.
Yeah.
It does leave a really strange kind of effect, and I find that I think it just takes a little bit of time to really come around to understanding what it is that you come away with. It's not a very immediate thing. I think in other institutions, perhaps, there's a little bit more of immediate kind of benchmark. Like, now I'm able to do this. And look at how my sort of career has, like, here's, like, formally I'm at this, I came in here and now I'm here.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's something there is a little bit of that at Cranbrook, but there's a deeper sort of, like, more latent kind of thing that starts to kind of grow the more you move away from it. And right now, the thing that I think I really think that my gospel, like my now sort of contemporary gospel, is like connecting design history to contemporary practice in this like very meaningful kind of way that isn't about the aesthetics, is completely a product of my experience at Cranbrook.
Oh, interesting.
Really, it really is in that way. I mean, like I had what I brought there, but then me and all of this kind of mess like thrown into this pot of Cranbrook and that structure that was there, or lack of structure, funneled into what I do now. I really couldn't see myself being able to make the same connections that I make now without having had that experience.
Oh, that's interesting.
Cooper by itself wouldn't have been enough. It was Cooper, work, Cranbrook,
Yeah,
other
yeah,
things,
and
but
that's how it
it's
always,
yeah, totally.
seems to go. My last question. This is a question that I end all of these with, and it's a hard question, and it's probably going to be especially hard for you in this room that we're in. But I'm always curious, kind of, who are the writers or the books that have really kind of influenced how you think about
Mm,
kind of all of this stuff
hmm
that we've talked about, that I realize, as we're sitting in a room
Yeah,
completely
just
surrounded
looking at all these
by
things.
books.
That's a good question. Yeah, it is a little hard.
Or even like the
Yeah.
people that you find yourself going back
hmm
to again and again.
Well, I think I wouldn't have had any sense of design history without Steve Heller. I mean,
Hmm. Yeah.
the body of work that Steve Heller's put out there is enormous and insane. I mean, I can't like even imagine like how much time he spent doing these things. And I think what's really I think what resonated with me about Steve's work is that he writes as a designer still. Like
Mm.
he's definitely like we would consider him as a design historian, design critic, design writer, but he is still and was a designer first. I
Yeah.
think like he came to that space out of interest towards history, but I think it's not like you can't be a good writer and a good critic of design if you're not a designer. I think that there's
Right.
distance in space that is helpful. But I think especially in design, I think it's important to be a designer, know how it's done to
Yeah.
kind of. So I've always appreciated that about Steve, and I think I keep going back to his work and discovering like, oh my God, there's like this thing he wrote like 20
Yeah.
years ago. It's like, oh my God, I had no idea. And it's something super useful. Like we often tend to know the things that are more contemporary. That kind of like you see them in the bookshops and stuff. But like his body of work is so vast, I find myself kind of going back to him. I really, I think like Unit Editions is
Oh yeah.
someone like a publisher who I think I have deep admiration for because their commitment to doing this
Yeah.
thing and really finding these things to write about and publish that may not be so kind
Yeah.
of on the top of the food chain kind of there. But I think they put a lot of passion and they put a lot of effort into making these beautiful objects, and they're desirable. They're the kinds of things that you want to own just because of the beauty of them, but also like if you spend time with them, which I really hope that everyone does, is like they're so insightful and they're
Right.
so well written, they're so constructed, like beautifully designed. They're really thoughtful things. So I go back to them a lot because of just the there's always something really useful and really interesting to glean from them. Yeah, and then there's like new people that I'm finding, people who are writing about stuff. Just giving the kind of a different framework to the kinds of conversation that we're having. I think that there's a
Mhm.
lot of stuff happening in Europe, trying to unpack, especially in Switzerland. I think that
Oh yeah.
there's a lot of designers and design kind of the new crop of design historians, design critics who are trying to grapple with the history of Swiss design and like the legacy that it still has. We collaborated with a group of designers, sort of from different parts of Switzerland, on Swiss Style Now exhibition that we had
Oh
a
yeah.
couple of years ago, and that allowed like we had a short kind of 1 day symposium and being able to connect to some of those people and some of the writing that I've seen. It's really opened up my eyes to the the kinds of conversations you can start having, especially within a very kind of strong visual culture of
Hmm.
like something like a Swiss design. But I've been really, really surprised. Not, I shouldn't be surprised, but I was really pleasantly surprised by the new perspective and kind of the new
Oh,
conversation that's coming out
interesting.
of that,
Yeah.
and like the models. I think there's called Mapping Swiss Design, the book.
Yeah.
So there's some really really great things that are happening there, and so it's I'm glad to see that there is sort of this interest in writing and publishing. A lot of it is kind of self-published
Yeah.
and finding rooms for that stuff to go. So I think that hopefully it's a really kind of fertile ground. I think that
Yeah.
people are connecting to the stuff. So I'm curious to like to see how it continues. Like what I think the
Yeah.
work that you do is propelling and pushing that same space. of talking about these things and making that relevant to, it's not, we designers need to think about, right? Not just exactly what they do, but like to have this bigger conversation, or at least to find a room in their day-to-day kind of just to focus. And I think like what I'm finding is I think the challenge I'm finding is like finding that sort of that sweet spot for knowing what designers, how little time designers have, like how to get something to them in a succinct kind of way that's enough to get them to get the insight, but also feel like they're not reading like a 300-page book of just dense kind of stuff, but just get them interested a little bit.
That's exactly that's like what I think about all the time, and that's like one of the reasons why this is a podcast, is because it seemed like another way to present a lot of information,
right,
while you can be doing something else, and maybe you can kind of get that in a different way. And so I think that's like
the
great
commute is always that's my saving grace. Like I can listen to this on a commute. Short enough, it's good.
So I think that's a good way to kind of wrap this up. Thank you so much for doing this. This was so fun. This was so interesting to me. So thanks for being on the podcast.
My pleasure. I appreciate it.
This episode was recorded on August 8th, 2018 in New York City. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, and SoundCloud, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.